On paper, Blackwater County, Ohio, was the kind of place where nothing strange was supposed to happen. It had one traffic light that only seemed to turn red when you were in a hurry, one diner that served meatloaf on Thursdays whether you liked it or not, and one sheriff who had been there long enough to know exactly how the town would breathe in and out with the seasons. His name was Caleb Mercer, and he considered routine to be as much a part of his job as the badge on his chest. Every morning, he woke up before the sun, sat at the edge of the bed for a minute to listen to the old farmhouse creak and settle, and stared at the framed photograph on his dresser. It was a black and white image of the Blackwater Woods, taken from somewhere off the old state road. A dense line of trees, a shallow ditch, a strip of gravel. Nothing remarkable. It had been a gift when he was sworn in, years ago. So you'll never forget what you're responsible for, the previous sheriff had said. Caleb never did. He knew the woods. He knew every bend in the road that skirted them, every washed-out shoulder and deer trail, every rusted fence post swallowed by moss. The woods were old, but they were consistent. Trees didn't move. Ground didn't rearrange itself. Buildings certainly didn't just appear. It was a comforting thought, and it carried him through a lot of quiet years. On that particular morning, he woke with a heaviness in his chest he couldn't immediately name. The alarm clock said 4:47 a.m. The color of the sky through the thin curtains was wrong, too pale, like the light had been washed once in cold water and hung up wet. The house felt stiller than usual, as if even the old pipes were holding their breath. He went through the motions anyway. Coffee, 2 slices of toast, one burned by accident and eaten anyway. Black uniform shirt, stiff at the collar, the familiar weight of the leather belt, the badge pinned over his heart. He glanced once at the photograph of the woods before he left. For a moment, he thought something about it looked different. He couldn't say what. Maybe a shadow out of place. Maybe nothing at all. Not real. Real. Not real. He locked the door behind him and walked to the cruiser. Gravel crunching under his boots. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of damp soil and leaves. A low fog clung to the fields, swallowing the fence lines and half the big maple by the road. It wasn't unusual for Blackwater, not with the river curling around the county the way it did, but this fog felt heavier, like it was being held close to the ground on purpose. When he started the engine, the radio gave a soft crackle and then went quiet. He tapped the side of the old unit with 2 fingers, more habit than anything else, and pulled out onto the road. His morning route never changed. Down the lane, left past the old Miller barn with the caved-in roof. Over the narrow bridge where kids used to throw rocks at the water before someone decided phones were more interesting. Then on to County Road 17, the long strip of pavement that cut through miles and miles of woods. It was muscle memory. He could have driven it with his eyes closed if he were the type of man to trust his life to anything other than what he could see. The fog grew denser as he approached the tree line, swallowing the beams of his headlights so they seemed to fold back on themselves. The edges of the road blurred. Bare branches emerged from the gray like reaching hands, then vanished again. He kept one hand on the wheel and one hand resting lightly near the radio mic. He didn't know why. There was no reason for nerves. It was just fog. It was just trees. It was just Blackwater being Blackwater. At mile marker 7, the woods pressed close to the road, tall and thin and dark. The fog smudged the spaces between trunks until it all seemed like one solid wall. Caleb checked his speed, then glanced briefly at the odometer. Out of habit. At mile marker 8, he passed the crooked sign someone had carved years ago and nailed to a post, "Welcome to Blackwater County, Pop 3104. Below it, someone had scratched a smaller line with a pocket knife. For now. He'd always meant to replace it. He never did. At mile marker 9, he took a breath in, deep and steady, just as he always did at that stretch. He didn't know when the habit had started. Maybe on a winter day, when the road was slick and the trees were black with rain. Maybe longer ago than he could remember. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. It was the same as it had always been. A curve in the road, a shallow ditch on the right, the tree line beyond. Nothing remarkable. He blinked. There was a cabin. He slowed so fast, the seat belt snapped tight across his chest. The cruiser's wheels spit gravel and then rolled to a stop. The cabin sat just beyond the ditch, nested in the trees like it had been there for years. Weathered planks, gray and warped with time. A slanted roof with a dark stain that might have been moss or rot. A front porch with a railing missing one slat. One small window to the left of the door, another to the right, glass opaque with grime. A single lamp glowed in the front window, pale and steady in the fog. Caleb stared at it. His heart beat once, hard enough that he felt it in his throat. He knew this stretch of road. He had driven past it almost every day for more than a decade. He had walked it during search parties, stood on the shoulder to direct traffic after a fallen tree blocked the lane, waited in his cruiser while a family of deer wandered across. There had never been a cabin. He blinked again, slow, as if clearing smoke from his eyes. The cabin remained, solid, present, real, not real, real, not real. His hand moved to the radio mic without him thinking about it, fingers closing around the worn plastic. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Mercer. I'm on 17 just past mile 9. He hesitated, aware of the absurdity even as the words formed. I've got a structure out here I don't recognize. Any new permits come through for construction by the East Woods? Static answered him at first, a soft, empty hiss. Then a voice came through. His own voice. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Mercer. I'm on 17 just past mile 9. I've got a structure out here I don't recognize. He froze. The radio continued, echoing him with a delay of a heartbeat. Then fell into silence. He let go of the mic as if it had burned him and stared at the radio unit, waiting for some rational explanation to rise up in his mind. Bad wiring, feedback loop, some old recording glitching through the line. The fog pressed against the cruiser windows. The lamp in the cabin window flickered once, then steadied. Caleb turned off the engine. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. His breath sounded too loud in the confined space, so he opened the door and stepped out. The air hit him cold and damp, smelling strongly of wet earth and something else beneath it. Something faint and metallic, like old coins left in the rain. He closed the cruiser door gently, not wanting the slam of it to break whatever fragile balance was holding the world together at that moment. The cabin waited. He crossed the road, boots sliding slightly on the loose gravel of the shoulder, then crunching softly as he stepped down into the ditch. The grass there was slick and flattened, but it didn't look driven over. No tire tracks leading in, no sign of a driveway, no sign of a foundation. The cabin rose straight from the ground, as if it had grown up out of the soil overnight. He paused at the base of the porch steps, a lifetime of procedure and training running through his head. Unknown structure. Unknown occupants. Possible trespass or illegal construction. Approach cautiously. Identify yourself. Check for signs of distress. He almost laughed at himself. The normalcy of the checklist felt thin and fragile. Sheriff's Department, he called out, voice steady by long habit. Anybody home? Nothing stirred. The lamp in the window glowed on, casting a weak light across the porch. He climbed the steps slowly. The wood beneath his boots felt wrong. Not rotten, not soft. It felt almost springy, with a faint give that reminded him, disturbingly, of pressing down on the palm of someone's hand. The front door was slightly ajar, just enough for a thin line of darkness to show at the edge. He stopped with his hand inches from the wood and listened. At first he heard nothing but his own breathing. Then, faintly, something else. A slow, rhythmic sound, distant and hollow. It took him a moment to realize it was a creaking, as if a chair were rocking gently somewhere deeper inside. He told himself someone could be hurt in there. An old squatter. A drifter. A kid hiding from something worse. Reason stepped in where intuition faltered. Not real. Real. Not real. He pushed the door open with his fingertips. The hinges moved without a sound. The darkness inside seemed thicker than the fog outside. as if it were a substance the room was filled with rather than an absence of light. Yet he could see, dimly, a narrow entryway, walls of the same weathered wood, a floor that looked dry and dusty, footprints tracked across it in smudged arcs. One set of footprints, bare and small, leading away from the door. Caleb's thumb found the switch on his shoulder flashlight, and a weak white beam cut across the interior. The prints were clearer now. Toes, arches, heels. The feet had to have belonged to a child. The creaking stopped. He stayed where he was. One foot on the threshold. One still on the porch, fighting the urge to simply shut the door and walk back to his car. To the road, to the life where the woods were just woods, and Mile 9 was just Mile 9. Instead, he stepped inside. The door swung silently closed behind him. For a moment, after the door closed, Caleb Mercer didn't move. He stood just inside the threshold, the cold from outside still clinging to his jacket, the dim interior of the cabin pressing close. The weak cone of his flashlight wavered slightly as his hand adjusted, and the beam caught dust hanging motionless in the air, as if the room were holding its breath. He realized he was holding his, too, and forced himself to exhale. The smell inside was different from what he'd expected. Cabins in the woods usually carried the scent of damp, of mold, or animals, or stale smoke. This one smelled faintly of river water and old paper, like a book left too close to an open window during a storm. The entryway was narrow, barely wide enough for him to stand comfortably with his shoulders squared. To his left, a wall. To his right, another wall. Straight ahead, a short hallway leading to a darker room. The trail of small, bare footprints led that way, each print slightly smudged but distinct enough to see the toes. "Sheriff's Department," he called again, voice quieter now in the enclosed space. "If anyone's here, I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to make sure you're okay." The words disappeared into the cabin without echo, as though the walls absorbed them. No answer came back. He swept the flashlight over the walls as he moved forward. The boards were old, but well-fitted. No gaps, no visible rot. The grain of the wood, twisted in strange patterns, knots forming shapes that made his eyes want to look away, almost like faces, if he stared too long. Eyes, mouths, not real, not real. He made himself keep walking. The hallway opened into a small main room. A table sat in the center, with two mismatched chairs pushed away from it at subtle, uneven angles, like the people who last used them had stood up in different moods. One chair had a cushion with the stuffing peeking out of a tier. The other was bare wood, worn smooth at the edges. On the table, there were objects arranged with disconcerting neatness. A ceramic mug with a hairline crack down one side. An ashtray with 3 cigarette butts, as if someone had ground them out carefully and then never bothered to empty it. An old key, large and iron, heavy enough to have once locked something important. And a picture frame. Caleb's flashlight slid over the items, then came back to the frame, drawn to it. He stepped up to the table and picked it up. The frame was wooden, polished to a soft sheen under the dust. The photograph inside was old, the edges browned, the image slightly blurred. It showed a stretch of woods, familiar in a way that made his stomach tighten. The tree line, near Mile 9, he was almost sure of it. In the foreground, standing in that space where he'd parked his cruiser, was the cabin. Same slanted roof, same crooked porch railing, same single window glowing with a faint light. Handwritten at the bottom of the photograph, just beneath the image, was a date. He felt suddenly as if someone had pressed a cold hand between his shoulder blades. The room seemed to tilt a fraction of an inch, barely enough to notice, just enough to make him aware of his own balance. He leaned closer to the photograph, squinting. There was a figure on the porch, barely visible, a man. It looked like, with broad shoulders and a hat pulled low, leaning against the post. The quality of the image made it impossible to see his face, but the stance was strangely familiar. He lowered the frame slowly and set it back exactly where he'd found it. Someone could have faked it, he told himself. Old photo from a flea market. Someone having a laugh. Photoshop and a cheap printer and a bit of coffee to stain the edges. Except when he touched the paper, it had felt fragile in a way that was hard to fake, as if it might crumble under too much pressure. He turned away from the table, following the footprints with the beam of his light. They led across the main room, past a narrow stove with no pipe leading out of the ceiling, past a small cabinet whose door stood slightly open, empty shelves inside. The prince stopped at the threshold of another room. This doorway had no door, just a frame where one might once have hung. Beyond it was a narrow hallway, longer than it had any right to be given the size of the cabin's exterior. The flashlight beam stretched and faded down it, swallowed before it reached the far end. He checked the width of the cabin in his mind, picturing where the outer walls should be. The numbers didn't add up. From the outside, the structure couldn't possibly accommodate a hall that long. It would push beyond the rear wall, jutting into the trees. He walked to the hallway entrance and paused, listening. Somewhere ahead, faint and irregular, there was a noise. A slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled along the floor. Then a pause. Then again, he thought of the bare footprints, the small feet. "Hey," he called softly, trying for gentle. "If you're a kid, you don't need to hide from me. I'm not going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. I just need to make sure you're safe." The dragging sound stopped. Silence filled the hall, so complete that he could hear the faint thud of his heart in his ears. He stepped into the hallway. The boards under his boots creaked, though not loudly. The walls on either side were closer together here, close enough that if he stretched his arms out he could probably touch both sides. He did not test that theory. His flashlight washed over more wood, more twisting grain. There were no pictures on these walls, no hooks or shelves, nothing to suggest anyone had ever tried to make this space comfortable. It felt like a passage inside a larger, hidden body, like he was walking down the throat of something. The air grew cooler as he went. His breath puffed out in faint clouds he could just barely see in the flashlight's beam. He kept expecting the hallway to end, to open into another room, or a back door, or a dead end that he could use as an excuse to turn around and leave. It did eventually open, but not in the way he'd imagined. The hall spilled into a small bedroom. The sudden change in space made him falter, one step falling harder than he'd intended. He corrected his balance and swept the light slowly across the room. There was a bed, low to the ground, with a faded quilt tucked neatly at the corners. The pattern on the fabric was worn, but he could make out little stars and moons in pale thread. A small wooden dresser stood against one wall, a round mirror hanging above it. The glass in the mirror was slightly warped, bending his reflection at the edges as he passed it. His eyes caught on a single object resting on the quilt. It was a toy sheriff's badge, carved from wood. The edges were sanded smooth, the star shape carefully cut, each point even. Where the metal pin would be on a real badge, there was just a small, shallow groove, as if someone had once intended to attach something and never did. He moved closer, drawn to it. The badge was about the size of his palm. He reached out and picked it up. The wood felt warm, warmer than it should have been in the cool air of the room. A faint vibration hummed through it, barely there, like the echo of a far-off engine or the memory of a heartbeat. He turned it over in his hand. On the back, scratched lightly into the surface, were letters. At first, he thought they might be random marks. But as he tilted the badge under the light, the lines resolved into a name, Caleb. His fingers went numb. He stared at the letters, tracing them with his eyes over and over. It could be coincidence, he told himself. Caleb wasn't the rarest name in the world. Some long-ago child with his name, living in some long-ago cabin, some father with a whittling knife, carving a badge for a kid who wanted to grow up to be like the men he saw in town. Except the badge was warm. Except the humming in his hand seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat, syncing up until he couldn't tell which was which. Not real. Real. Not real. He closed his fist around the badge, meaning to take it, to put it in an evidence bag later, to bring it back to the station where things made sense. The wood pressed against his palm, and for a second he had the strange sensation that it was closing its own fingers around his. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and turned toward the door. The hallway beyond the bedroom was gone. Where there had been a narrow passage a moment before, there was now only a blank wall, boards running vertically from floor to ceiling. No seam, no frame, no indication there had ever been an opening. He walked to it in 3 quick steps, heart suddenly pounding. Up close, the wall looked exactly like every other wall in the cabin. He pressed his free hand against it. The wood was solid. No give. No hollow places. He stepped back, then forward again, scanning for any sign of a door. A panel. A hinge. Anything. There was nothing. He turned slowly, taking in the room again. The bed. The dresser. The warped mirror. The quilt with its stitched stars. The air felt smaller now. The ceiling lower. The corners darker. He still held the wooden badge. It seemed heavier than it had when he'd picked it up. He realized, with a cold, crawling clarity, that the faint humming from it had stopped. The warmth had leached out, leaving it cool against his skin. He slipped it into his pocket. "All right," he said, to the empty room, his voice too loud in the confined space. "That's enough." He'd seen houses with bad foundations go crooked. He'd seen old barns sag and twist until their interiors didn't match their exteriors anymore. He'd seen tricks of light and fog thick enough to choke on it. But walls didn't appear where hallways had been a moment before. Paths didn't simply rearrange themselves behind you. He went to the window, intending to look out to get his bearings, to prove to himself that the world outside was where it was supposed to be. The glass was cloudy, streaked with grime. He wiped at it with his sleeve, clearing a small circle. The view outside made him stop thinking altogether. From this angle, he should have seen the ditch, the road, the line of trees on the other side. Instead, he saw more forest. Thick and endless and dark. No sign of the cruiser. No strip of gravel. No mile marker. No road at all. Just trees. They seemed closer to the cabin than they had been from the outside. Pressing in, leaning toward the window as if to listen, he stared at them, willing something familiar to emerge. A particular bent trunk he could recognize. A break in the branches where he might orient himself. Nothing offered itself. Not real, not real. His reflection in the glass wavered with his breath. For an instant, the shape looking back at him didn't seem like him at all. The hat was wrong, the shoulders broader, the outline of the badge on the chest a different shape. Then he blinked, and it was just his own face again, drawn and pale. He turned away from the window, intending to try the wall again to look for any sign of hidden mechanism. The bedroom door stood open, but beyond it, instead of the blank wall or the long hallway, he could see a slice of the main room, the table and chairs visible at an angle that didn't quite make sense. He stepped through, and the cabin seemed to breathe around him, adjusting itself. The hallway was gone. The bedroom now opened directly into the main room, as if that had always been the case, as if his memory of walking down a long, narrow passage was the part that wasn't real. He felt the shape of the wooden badge in his pocket, pressing against his leg, an unfamiliar weight. He suddenly wanted very much to be back in his cruiser, engine running, radio crackling with the ordinary nonsense of the day. Faded country songs, traffic updates. Linda, at the diner, calling to complain about a customer skipping the bill. He wanted all of that with a desperate, aching clarity. Instead, he was standing in a cabin that had not been on the side of the road the day before, holding a toy badge with his name scratched into it, under the gaze of trees that seemed to be slowly, patiently, leaning closer. He realized, not for the first time in his life, that wanting something and getting it were rarely aligned. He straightened his shoulders, forced his breathing into a steady rhythm, and walked toward the front door, intending to put his hand on the knob, pull it open, and step back out into the foggy morning. When he reached it, his hand met bare wood. There was no knob. For a long, still moment, Caleb simply stared at the empty place where the doorknob should have been. The wood was smooth beneath his fingertips, as if it had never been fitted with hardware at all. He pressed his palm flat against the surface, expecting some subtle indication of outline or seam, any tactile evidence that a door had once functioned here. There was nothing, just cool grain, unbroken. He stepped back, heart working harder in his chest now, each beat sharp and insistent. The door looked exactly as it had when he entered. The shape was there, the frame intact. But the mechanism that allowed it to open, the thing that made it a door instead of just a wall, had vanished. He pressed both hands against it, expecting at least a faint give. There was none. He pushed harder. Still nothing. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and pushed slowly this time, the way one might try to open a heavy barn door swollen from rain. The wood remained firm, unmoving, indifferent. His mind flicked through a series of possibilities, none of them comforting, all of them implausible. Maybe he had overlooked something. Maybe the knob had fallen off when the door closed behind him, and he hadn't heard it hit the floor. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate prank. But the house did not feel like a prank. It felt ancient, patient, and aware. He turned around, scanning the room again. The table, the chairs, the photograph in its frame. All of it exactly as before, but now carrying a subtle, invisible tension, like a stage waiting for a second actor to step into the light. Caleb's pulse eased only slightly when he saw that the small cabinet near the stove was still open. He stepped toward it and crouched, checking its contents again. Empty shelves stared back. He checked the stove next. The metal was cold. No signs of recent use, no ash, no soot, no lingering scent of fuel. He placed his hand on it, half expecting it to vibrate or hum, but it remained still beneath his palm. When he straightened, the floorboards creaked softly, though not under his weight. The sound came from the far corner of the room. He turned, sweeping his gaze toward the corner where the shadows collected thickest, just beyond the reach of the weak daylight, trickling in through the grimy windows. He narrowed his eyes, waiting for something to shift. Nothing moved, but he knew he had heard it. He approached slowly, careful with each step. The boards were cool beneath his boots. The air felt heavier the closer he got, as if the entire room were trying to push him back with invisible hands. The corner stood empty, no furniture, no planks out of place, just wood and dust. He crouched, shining his light along the floor. Then he saw it, not movement, but shape. A single bare footprint, small, child-sized, imprinted in the dust as if the foot had pressed into it only moments ago. He had followed footprints into the hallway before. These were new. His throat tightened. The rational part of his mind fired through the possibilities. A real child was still inside. Maybe hiding. Maybe afraid. Maybe hurt. But even as he looked at the small impression in the dust, he felt the weight of a different truth settle in his bones, a quiet, certain understanding that nothing about this cabin followed rules he knew. Still, he had an obligation to act. "Hey," he said, voice even, gentle. "I'm not leaving without making sure you're safe." The silence that answered him stretched long enough to feel intentional. He stood and moved toward the nearest doorway, the one that had led to the bedroom earlier. The layout of the cabin still didn't make sense, but the bedroom at least was something he recognized, something he could map in his mind. As he crossed the threshold, he hesitated. The room was darker now, though the window admitted the same pale light as before. Shadows clung to the corners in ways that seemed too deep, too layered. He stepped inside. The bed looked as it had. The quilt, faded. The mirror, warped. The dresser, still slightly uneven on its legs. But the wooden sheriff's badge he had taken his name carved into the back was not where it had been on the quilt. It was back, lying in the exact spot, as though it had never left. His breath caught in his chest. Slowly, he reached into his pocket. The badge was gone. For the first time that morning, true fear crept beneath his ribs, cold and hollow. Fear not of danger, but of impossibility. Of rules breaking quietly underfoot. Of reality folding in on itself like soft paper. He stepped toward the bed and hovered a hand over the badge. He didn't touch it. Not this time. The room felt different, slanted, as if the floor had shifted a degree to one side. He looked at the mirror, noticing how the glass bent his reflection. His face elongated in strange, uneven ways. His shoulders sloped unnaturally. It was still him, but wrong. He looked away. The urge to leave the room grew heavy, thick in his limbs. He backed out into the main room, breathing steadier once the doorway was behind him. He needed to find another exit, a window he could open, a seam in the wall. He refused to accept the idea that a cabin could simply trap him. He approached the nearest window, wiping at the dirty glass with his sleeve. But as he cleared a patch, the outside view seemed altered. The trees were closer, much closer, their trunks rising like pillars only a few feet from the cabin walls. When he leaned in, he could see bark etched with lines he didn't recognize. Deep grooves, spiraling upward like some old carving that had grown as the tree grew. He moved to another window. Same thing. The forest pressed tight against the cabin. He felt as though the building were being swallowed silently, inch by inch. Not real. Real. Not real. He stepped back from the window and scanned the entire room again. Slower this time, searching for details he might have overlooked. A hatch. A hatchway. Anything. His eyes landed on a narrow gap between the stove and the wall. He approached it, crouched, and pushed some loose boards aside. A small door, no bigger than one he might have found on an old utility cupboard, sat flush against the floor. It had no handle, just an indentation where fingers might pull. He hesitated. The last door he touched had vanished on him. Still, he reached down. As soon as his fingertips brushed the indentation, the cabin groaned, not loudly, but deeply. A sound that seemed to come from the bones of the structure itself. He froze. The air shifted. Behind him, a faint floorboard creaked soft, hesitant, like someone taking a step. He turned slowly. The main room was empty, but another set of footprints had appeared starting near the table, arcing toward him, stopping just a few feet from where he crouched. Small, child-sized, he rose to standing. "All right," he said, voice quiet but steady. "I know you're here. I don't know what you want from me, but I'm not playing hide and seek. Show yourself." Silence answered, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It felt full now. Weighted. Expectant. His jaw tightened. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, grounding himself in procedure because it was all he had. He approached the table again. The photograph lay where he'd left it, but something was different enough that it tugged at his attention. He picked it up. The cabin in the picture remained unchanged. But the man on the porch, the one whose face he couldn't see before, was now closer to the camera. The tilt of his hat was familiar. Too familiar. His throat tightened. The man's stance was his own. Posture, shoulders, even the way his hands rested near his pockets. The resemblance couldn't be an accident. He lowered the photo. The cabin groaned again, louder this time, the boards shifting subtly under his feet as if the structure were breathing. He moved toward the door again, pressing his palm flat to the smooth wood, trying once more to feel for a seam. None. He turned to the windows again, desperate for another option. But something new had happened there too. The trees were even closer, so close he could see the condensation of his own breath ghosting across the glass. Reality bending in small increments. The walls of the cabin seemed to inch inward. Or maybe that was his imagination, feeding on fear. Hard to tell the difference anymore. Not real. Real. Not real. The radio on his hip crackled softly, making him jump. He grabbed it, thumb on the button. "Dispatch. This is Mercer. I need confirmation if anyone has reported a missing child near." His own voice cut him off. "Dispatch, this is Mercer. I need confirmation." He stopped speaking. The radio continued for 2 more words before falling silent again. He clipped it back onto his belt with a clenched jaw. The cabin seemed to shift again, the shadows in the corners pooling deeper. Then, without warning, the front door shuddered once, sharply, as if something on the other side had struck it. Caleb backed away, hand near his holster, but not drawing. The door didn't move again, but when he looked down at the floor, another footprint had appeared, larger this time, closer to his own size. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, his mind tightening around the realization that the cabin wasn't showing signs of life. It was responding. It was interacting. And it wasn't done with him. He squared his shoulders and stepped toward the center of the room, turning in a slow circle as if to face every wall at once. "All right," he said, into the dim light. "If you want something from me, you're going to have to show me more than footprints and tricks." The air shifted behind him, cold brushing the back of his neck. He turned fast. The bedroom door had closed on its own. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling the first true fracture of certainty in his mind. The cabin wasn't reacting randomly. It was guiding him, or hurting him. The difference mattered less than the direction. He took one slow step toward the bedroom door, then another. When he reached it, he put his hand on the wood. It was warm. The faintest whisper of a pulse beat beneath his palm. Not real. Real. Not real. He pushed the door open and stepped into the dark. The darkness swallowed him for only a moment before his eyes adjusted. But what came into focus was not what he expected. The bedroom he'd entered before was gone. In its place stretched a narrow corridor lined with walls that leaned slightly inward, as though the cabin were folding itself around him. The boards here were older, rougher, marked with deep grooves and scratches that might once have been accidental but now formed patterns too deliberate to ignore. The grain twisted in spirals that led the eye downward, forcing him to follow the curve whether he wanted to or not. He stepped forward, one slow pace, then another. The floorboards beneath his boots creaked softly, the sound traveling ahead of him like an announcement of his presence. Dust drifted in faint currents with each step, though the air was too still for wind. This section of the cabin felt untouched, as if no one had crossed its threshold for decades, maybe longer. As he walked, the corridor appeared to stretch. The end, which at first seemed only a few yards away, receded with every step, pulling away like something alive and teasing. He refused to acknowledge the way his heartbeat quickened. Fear, he understood. Panic, he knew how to suppress. But disorientation, that was harder. It ate at thoughts in thin, precise lines. He swallowed once and checked the walls again. The strange grooves seemed deeper here, cutting into the boards in wide arcs. He traced one with his fingers, half expecting to feel a rough edge, but the wood was strangely smooth, as if the marks were polished. The pattern reminded him faintly of a fingerprint, spiraling inward. He pulled his hand away. Halfway down the corridor, something changed. The dust on the floor thickened, clumping into subtle ridges where something had disturbed it. Caleb crouched, examining the disturbance. They weren't footprints, more like drag marks, long and uneven, as though something had been pulled or had crawled slowly across the floor. The answer that came unbidden was one he refused to entertain. He continued down the hall, following the marks. Still no end in sight. He stopped, turning slowly to look behind him. He froze. The door he'd entered through was much farther away than it should have been. The corridor stretched behind him, longer than any space in the cabin's footprint could possibly accommodate. Not real. Real? Not real. He took a breath, grounding himself. Theories spun through his mind: optical illusion, structural trick, hallucination. But none of them held. Every step forward felt as solid as the one before. Every board creaked under real weight. Every grain in the wood was tangible. Something tugged at his attention, then a faint sound, barely perceptible but distinct enough to freeze him in place. A rhythmic, dragging whisper. Not quite footsteps. Not quite breathing. Something between. It came from ahead, deeper in the hallway. He straightened, hand drifting toward his holster out of instinct more than intention. His fingers brushed the grip but did not close around it. A weapon felt out of place here. The threat wasn't physical. It was the distortion of the world itself. Still, he moved forward. The corridor narrowed now, pressing from both sides, encouraging him to turn back even as the dragging sound grew clearer. He kept going, shoulders nearly brushing the walls. It occurred to him that if the corridor tightened even a little more, he would be unable to continue or retreat. When the dragging finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. The kind of silence that happens when something is waiting. Up ahead, dim light seeped from a crack in the boards, forming a thin, horizontal line. Caleb approached cautiously. It looked like the threshold of a door, barely open, leaking pale illumination. He reached the crack, positioned his fingers along the edge, and pushed gently. The door swung inward. The room inside was surprisingly small. A study of some kind, perhaps. A desk sat near the far wall, piled with yellowed paper and a typewriter whose keys were stained with rust. A single chair stood behind it, carved of dark wood, its back high and impossibly straight. The air smelled of damp ink and something older, something like mildew clinging to the spine of a forgotten book. Caleb stepped inside. The room felt wrong immediately. The proportions were strange, the corners too sharp, the ceiling too low. It reminded him of staged sets in old photographs, spaces built to suggest something real, without ever being real themselves. On the desk, scattered papers formed a rough pile. He lifted a few, scanning the faded handwriting. The words were nearly illegible, but he could make out fragments. The child will not. The cycle continues. Sheriff after sheriff after sheriff. Always returns. His stomach tightened. He picked up another page, different handwriting this time, neater, firmer. It read, "He will come when the forest is listening." Below it was a date, smudged beyond recognition. He set the papers down carefully and turned his attention to the typewriter. A sheet of paper sat rolled into it. The edge yellowed, but the typed letters stark and clear. He bent closer to read. "Sheriff Mercer has arrived." The words punched into the paper with force, each letter pressed deep enough to leave slight impressions on the roller beneath. His breath stalled. He hadn't heard typing. He hadn't heard anyone else in the cabin at all. Slowly, he straightened, suddenly aware that the room felt smaller than when he entered. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker. His shoulders brushed the edges as he turned. He moved toward the door, but before he reached it, the typewriter clicked once behind him. Just a single keystroke. He stopped, turned. A second letter had been added, falling just below the first line. "Sheriff Mercer has arrived. He does not know." The keys rested motionless, dust clinging to them. He took a step backward, keeping the desk in sight as he reached for the doorframe. The air around him vibrated faintly like the hum of a hidden generator deep underground. He crossed the threshold. The moment he did, the corridor behind him collapsed inward. He didn't see it happen. He heard it. A deep groan of bending boards, the sharp cracking of wood, the hush of dust shifting. He spun around in time to see the hallway narrowing from both ends, walls folding like paper, until only a few feet remained between him and the study door. The cabin was rearranging itself, adapting, reacting. He stumbled back into the main room. Everything was exactly as it had been, the table, the chairs, the stove. But the cabin felt different now, like something had awakened. He moved toward the front door again, searching for seams he knew weren't there. He still tried. His hands pressed against the wood, palms flat. No indentation, no knob, no give. His breath pushed out through clenched teeth, frustration bleeding into a deeper fear he wasn't yet ready to name. His foot brushed something on the floor. He looked down. Another footprint. But this one wasn't small. It was the size of his own, an exact match in shape, tread, and depth. Except it faced away from the door. As though he had been standing there moments before. As though he had already tried to leave. A cold wave of unease crawled up his spine. Not real. Real. Not real. He stepped back, eyes glued to the print. And then he noticed another one, near the table, and another near the bedroom door, all matching his boots. He felt the world tighten around him, an invisible coil drawing inward. He realized then that the cabin wasn't merely trapping him. It was tracking him, recording him, duplicating his steps, learning him. He didn't understand how that was possible, but the evidence lay etched in dust and floorboards, plain as any trail he'd ever followed through the woods. He took a steadying breath and forced his voice low, deliberate. "All right," he said into the dim air. "You know me. I want to know you." The cabin gave no answer. But somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, something shifted. Something large. Something alive. Caleb backed away slowly. The weight of the toy badge returned magically to its place, pressing on his mind like a ghost hand. He needed to understand. He needed to see more. Because whatever this place was, whatever mind it possessed, it had singled him out. Sheriff Mercer had arrived, and the cabin knew it. Caleb stood in the center of the main room, the dust-heavy air pressing against him with a weight that felt almost deliberate. The cabin was no longer simply a structure. It felt, though he hated the word for its imprecision, aware. It responded not to logic, but to attention, reshaping itself around whatever he happened to look at or think about. He took a slow, controlled breath. The air tasted faintly metallic, like the tang of blood without the sharpness. He scanned the room again and tried to anchor himself in procedure, because procedure was steady. Procedure was real. But the room itself kept shifting in ways that made procedure useless. His eyes went to the table, still holding the photograph. The mug, the iron key, and something about the arrangement struck him as different. He stared at the key for several seconds, narrowing his eyes. It was turned. Not much. Maybe a quarter rotation, enough that the bow pointed slightly toward the door rather than the wall. He blinked. The shift was subtle enough that doubt slid in easily. Had it always faced that way? Had he misremembered? Or had something turned it while his back was turned? Not real. Real. Not real. He lifted the key, weighing it in his hand. It was colder than he expected, the metal almost biting against his palm. The photograph beneath it was unchanged, the dated image of the cabin standing in the same place it shouldn't have stood in 1891. Except one detail was new. The figure on the porch, the barely visible silhouette, was no longer facing the camera. It had turned. Now, its head tilted at the exact angle Caleb was tilting his own. He lowered the photo with deliberate slowness and set the key back precisely where he'd found it, refusing to let his hands shake. If this place wanted to play mirrors with him, it wouldn't get the satisfaction of seeing fear break through. He steadied himself and crossed the room to the stove. The small door he'd found earlier, the floor-level panel, still sat, tucked partially in shadow. He crouched and examined the wood around it. No new footprints near it. No marks indicating it had been opened or closed since he last touched it. The indentation where his fingertips had brushed it earlier felt slightly deeper now, almost like something on the other side had pulled from within. He straightened quickly. The cabin groaned above him, boards flexing in long, low creaks, as though adjusting its posture. The sound reverberated through the floorboards, up through his boots, and into his bones. Then, the radio at his shoulder crackled again. Caleb tensed, hand hovering above the mic without touching it. Static hissed. Then a voice emerged, faint, distant, almost underwater. Sheriff Mercer. He froze. The voice wasn't quite his own, but it was close. Too close. Like someone imitating him imperfectly, or a recording degrading with every replay. He brought the mic to his mouth. "This is Sheriff Mercer. Identify yourself." Silence. He waited. Then, softly, "Not real." His breath hitched, not fear, not shock, something deeper. Recognition. The static swelled again, swallowing the voice. He released the mic, let it fall back to his shoulder, and exhaled through clenched teeth. The radio unit was old, but not broken. It had never done anything like this. He made a mental note of every detail so he could report it later, if later still existed in a recognizable form. The room grew colder. He could see the faint ghost of his breath when he exhaled. The window panes fogged from the inside, though he hadn't touched them. He wiped a circle clear on the nearest one. Beyond the glass, the forest had changed again. The trees now leaned inward at angles that defied nature, trunks converging above the cabin like a rib cage closing in. The shadows beneath the branches sharpened, forming long, thin shapes that pointed toward the cabin like arrows. More disturbingly, the road was gone, completely engulfed by trees, as though it had never existed. He stepped back, pulse hammering in his throat. He knew roads. He knew trees. He knew that neither behaved like this, not even with the strangest weather patterns the county offered. Reality didn't bend through intention or observation. Unless, he stopped the thought before it fully formed. Not real. Real, not real. He turned sharply toward the bedroom door again. It hung partially open now, though he remembered leaving it wide. A faint draft pushed through it, carrying the smell of damp soil and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit beginning to rot. He approached slowly. The wooden sheriff's badge was still on the quilt, but the quilt had changed. The stitched stars and moons had shifted positions. A crooked line of stars now resembled a shape he recognized from his own childhood, drawn on a school project taped to his mother's refrigerator. A crude shape of Ohio. A chill ran the length of his spine. The badge on the bed seemed almost aglow with the dim light filtering in from the window. He lifted it again. Warm. Humming faintly, but the name carved on the back. He swallowed. Where it had read Caleb before, it now read, Sheriff Caleb Mercer. His full name, his title, carved in letters that looked fresher than before, the cuts sharp and clean. He dropped the badge onto the quilt and stepped back quickly, his pulse thudding in his ears. That's enough, he said, into the empty air. Anger pushing back against the fear rising in him. No answer, just the walls shifting softly, like something breathing behind them. He moved back into the main room, determined to find a new path. He tracked the perimeter, running his fingers along the seams where walls met. Every surface felt solid, complete. No cracks, no hinges, no doors. The only openings were the bedroom and the new study he'd discovered. And as he turned toward the study door, he saw movement. A shadow passed across the threshold. He froze. The shadow was the size of a child. Light flickered in the study, not lamplight, not daylight. Something colder, like illumination from a screen of static. Caleb took one step toward the door, then another. When he reached the threshold, he stopped. The study was empty, but the typewriter now held a new line of text. Sheriff Mercer has arrived. He does not know. He will learn. Caleb backed away, refusing to give the room his back, but unwilling to step closer. The cabin moaned around him, wood shifting, responding. He turned toward the front door again, driven now by something sharper than fear, desperation. He slammed both palms against the wood. "Let me out," he said, voice low and tight. The cabin answered with a soft crack, like a knuckle popping in a hand too large to comprehend. He stepped back, chest heaving. His reflection in the window caught his eye again. The warped glass distorted his shape, but this time, the distortion was unmistakably wrong. His reflection wore a different hat, a different badge, an old sheriff's uniform he had only seen in historical photographs. His reflection raised its hand when he did, but when Caleb lowered his hand, the reflection didn't. It kept its hand raised. A silent warning, or a greeting. The room tilted. His vision blurred for a moment, like a camera lens shifting focus. He steadied himself against the table and whispered the words he had repeated in his mind since he'd stepped into the cabin. Not real. Real. Not real. But the cabin had heard him before, and it answered. Somewhere in the walls, a whisper echoed back. Real. Just that one word. Soft. Final. And completely certain. Caleb stepped away from the table, backing toward the center of the room, pulse pounding. The world around him felt thinner now, stretched tight as skin over bone. He could feel the cabin watching him not with eyes, but with structure, with space. Then the radio crackled again. "Sheriff Mercer," the warped voice murmured. "It's time." He spun toward the bedroom. The door swung shut on its own. His breath hitched. The floor under his feet shifted just slightly, just enough to be felt. And the cabin, every board, every beam, every nail, seemed to settle into a new configuration, as if preparing, as if waiting for the next step. Something had begun, and Caleb Mercer knew, with a cold certainty that cut deeper than fear, that the cabin wasn't reacting randomly. It was guiding him somewhere. It was shaping him. The cycle had started, and he was inside it now. The cabin exhaled. Caleb felt it more than heard it, a long, slow movement of air, as though the structure had lungs somewhere deep under the floorboards. The lights in the room dimmed, not by bulbs fading, but by the walls themselves seeming to absorb what little daylight seeped through the windows. A pressure settled in the air, heavy, expectant. He took one step back from the center of the room, instincts clawing up from some old, buried place inside him. Not fear of attack, fear of the unknown shape of the world now forming around him. Fear of the way reality had begun to unspool, thread by thread, like an old sweater fraying in the dark. The radio on his shoulder crackled again. Not the familiar static, not the warped echo of his own voice. This time, it was breathing, not his. Slow, labored, wet, almost. Like someone inhaling through a throat filled with smoke. He unhooked the radio with shaking fingers and raised it to his ear. The breathing continued for several seconds, long enough for the rhythm to imprint itself in his mind, long enough for him to realize something chilling. The breath wasn't steady. It was struggling, strained, desperate. A voice followed, thin as a spiderweb thread stretched too far. Caleb. He almost dropped the radio. The voice wasn't his, wasn't distorted, wasn't old. It was a child's. Faint, fragile, close. He lowered the radio slowly, pulse thudding so hard it blurred his vision at the edges. "No," he murmured, voice tight. "No, no, there's no child here." A creak above him cut him off. He looked up. The ceiling boards shifted under weight. Something small, moving across the beams. Something that paused directly above him. A soft tapping followed the gentle rhythm of bare feet. The same sound he'd heard in the cabin's depths hours earlier. Except this was directly overhead. Before he could react, dust sifted down in a thin stream, like ash shaken loose from a chimney. He stepped aside instinctively, brushing it from his shoulder. He stared upward, breath held. A second set of steps joined the first. He stepped back again, backing toward the front door without realizing it. The ceiling creaked under the weight of two small bodies now, then a third. He froze. 3 sets of footsteps, moving independently, circling above him, circling him. A chill melted down his spine like ice water. He turned toward the door again. Still no knob, still no seam. His throat tightened. Not real. Real, not real. But the footsteps were real enough to raise dust. Real enough to shift the ceiling beams. Real enough to make the cabin moan softly under the weight. He took a single, steady breath and forced his mind back into the patterns that police training had carved into it. Assess. Orient. React. He moved toward the bedroom again, not because he wanted to, but because every other wall was a dead end and the cabin clearly wanted him moving. As he neared the doorway, the door swung open on its own. He stopped short. The room beyond was no longer the bedroom. The bed was gone. The dresser. The mirror. Everything. Instead, it was a hallway. But not like the long, narrow one he had walked earlier. This one stretched infinitely in both directions, vanishing into dimness like a tunnel with no end. It should not have fit inside the cabin. He stepped to the threshold and rested a hand on the frame. The wood throbbed faintly beneath his palm, like a slowed heartbeat. He removed his hand quickly. He glanced over his shoulder. The ceiling creaked again. The footsteps above him began moving faster, small feet pattering, like children running in circles. He didn't know what waited in the hallway, but he knew what waited above him was no better. He stepped inside. The hallway extended in both directions. Same boards, same seams, same faint smell of river water and rot. No doors, no windows, no end. He chose a direction at random left and began walking. After 10 steps, the main room behind him faded from sight. After 20, he heard the faint echo of something metallic sliding across the boards. After 30, the air grew colder again. He kept walking. A sound rose in the distance, a single typewriter key striking, echoing down the hallway like a knock. He quickened his pace. Then another keystroke. Then another. The sound repeated in steady rhythm, a pattern forming. Click, click, click. With each strike, the hallway lights, if they could be called lights, flickered faintly. He didn't understand why, but the rhythm felt familiar, like a pattern he had heard somewhere, long ago. Something from childhood. Something from school, perhaps. A spelling test. A Morse code lesson. A memory he couldn't quite place. The clicks stopped. He froze. Silence engulfed him again. Then, his radio crackled. Caleb. The child's voice again. Closer. This time, the child's tone carried urgency. Panic. Don't look. He turned immediately, scanning the hall behind him. Nothing. He turned forward again. And stopped dead. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway. Too far to see clearly, but not too far to recognize. A child. Barefoot, head tilted, one arm hanging loosely, the other raised slightly as if reaching out. Caleb lifted his flashlight instinctively, but the beam flickered once and died. He took a step forward. The child took a step back. He took another. The child mirrored him, but the hall between them did not change. The child never grew closer or farther. The space between them remained fixed, despite the movement. Reality buckled around the idea of distance. He stood still. The child stood still. Then, the figure shifted. The body blurred at the edges, like heat rising from asphalt. Limbs lengthened. Shoulders broadened. The head tilted further. The shape grew taller, older. The figure now resembled a man. Caleb's breath caught. Another shift, quick this time. The man's form sharpened, and the silhouette became familiar. It was him, or an approximation of him. Older, tired, shoulders heavier with weight he hadn't yet carried. The figure raised its hand, exactly the same gesture his reflection had made in the window earlier. He took a step back, heart hammering. The figure did not follow. It only watched him. He backed away further, retreating down the hall. The figure remained, frozen in a stance that felt like a warning. Then, the hallway around him groaned. Boards shifted. The walls closed in. He broke into a run. The corridor narrowed as he sprinted, trying to breathe evenly. Trying to ignore how the walls scraped his shoulders, how the ceiling pressed closer, how the air tasted like old dust and cold stone. He ran until the hallway split suddenly into 3 identical passages. He stopped. Left, right, straight ahead. Each path flickered, like film skipping between frames. He closed his eyes. Not real. Real. Not real. He stepped forward into the center path, and the world opened. He stumbled out of the hallway, nearly falling onto the familiar floorboards of the main room. He spun around. The hallway door slammed shut. He grabbed the handle instinctively, but there wasn't one. The seam vanished instantly, replaced by a blank wall. Behind him, the cabin creaked deeply. Then, footsteps descended from the ceiling. Slow, heavy, too heavy for a child. The sound traced the beams in deliberate rhythm until it reached the place directly above the front door. Then, silence. Caleb turned slowly toward the front window. His reflection stared back, but it wasn't distorted now. It wasn't curious or warning. It was smiling. A small, slow smile that did not belong to him. His hands trembled. Not real. Real. Not real. A whisper rose behind the glass, soft, stretched thin like a voice traveling a long distance. Welcome back. His reflection raised its hand. The cabin exhaled again, and Caleb understood, with a horror deeper than anything the woods had ever taught him, that the cabin was no longer manifesting a haunting. It was manifesting him. The reflection in the window did not move at first. It held the smile thin, knowing, patient, while Caleb stood frozen, every instinct inside him crackling like exposed wire. He tried to steady his breathing, to ground himself in the simple rhythm of inhale and exhale, but even his own breath felt foreign now, like he was mimicking someone else's movements instead of making his own. He raised one hand. His reflection did not follow. Instead, it tilted its head slowly to the right, the smile widening by a fraction. A dread unlike anything he had ever felt bloomed in his chest. He stepped backward. The reflection stepped forward. Not real. Real? Not real. He turned away from the window, refusing to look again, and stumbled toward the center of the room. His hands shook. His thoughts fractured into looping fragments, half logic, half something darker. He needed to get out. He needed to understand. He needed something. Anything. His gaze snapped to the table. The photograph had changed again. The cabin in the picture remained the same slanted roof, same forest line, but the figure on the porch was no longer facing the camera. It was facing him, closer than before. No longer a silhouette. The face was visible now. He felt his stomach drop. The face in the photograph was his own. Older, weathered, eyes sunken as if staring too long at something no human was meant to see. The older version of him looked directly at the camera at him with an expression that hovered somewhere between warning and resignation. Caleb's fingers trembled as he lifted the photograph. The paper felt warm. He flipped it over. On the back, scrawled in handwriting that could have been his slanted letters, uneven pressure, was a single line. "Don't become me." His breath stuttered. He dropped the photograph onto the table. It landed face up. The older Caleb stared back at him, unblinking. He backed away until his spine met the wall. The cabin groaned deeply, a sound like a massive tree bending under storm wind. The lights dimmed again, shadows pooling at the edges of the room. He closed his eyes. Just breathe. He tried to speak aloud, to order his thoughts into clarity. But the words tangled, stuck, slipped. "Not real," he whispered. "Real. Not real." A whisper followed immediately, soft, close, just behind his left ear. "Real." He jerked away from the wall, heart hammering, but no one stood behind him. The shadows only clung there, denser than the rest of the room. He needed to move, needed to break whatever hypnosis the cabin tried to weave around him. He forced himself to look directly at the bedroom door, still closed, though he hadn't closed it. Slowly, he crossed the room, each step deliberate and quiet, as if the floorboards themselves were listening. He reached the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. He pushed it open. The room beyond had shifted again. No bed, no dresser, no mirror. This time, the room was filled with chairs, all facing the door. Chairs of every kind, rockers, dining chairs, schoolhouse seats, porch slats lined up in tight rows like a congregation awaiting sermon. Dust clung to them in thick layers. None looked moved recently, but all pointed at him with unsettling precision. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform that hadn't existed before, sat a single lone chair, a sheriff's chair, high-backed, oak, crafted with authority in mind. A badge carved from the same wood was fixed into the top rail. His badge. He took an involuntary step backward, hand reaching for the doorframe to steady himself. "No," he breathed. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him, rattling the frame. He lunged for it, grabbing the edges, pulling hard. It didn't budge. The chairs remained still, silent, waiting. He tried to breathe through the rising panic. He swallowed hard and forced himself to step deeper into the room. As he did, a faint whisper threaded through the air, low and layered with many voices. "One of us." His pulse pounded so violently, he felt it echo behind his eyes. He moved down the aisle, formed by the chairs. Each passing seat seemed to lean toward him, as if straining to hear his footsteps. Near the platform, he stopped. A second photograph lay on the sheriff's chair. Hand trembling, he lifted it. This one was older, sepia-toned, edges curled. It showed a gathering of sheriffs from long ago, standing in front of a building he didn't recognize. 11 men in wide-brimmed hats stared straight out of the photograph, expressions stern, unsmiling. But something was wrong. Their shadows were missing. The ground behind them was smooth, clean, empty. And in the very back row, barely visible, stood another figure. Blurry, dark, tall, something that didn't belong. He flipped the photograph over. 5 handwritten words, cramped and desperate. "We never left the cabin." A chill pierced straight through his chest. He dropped the photograph. Chairs scraped slowly against the floor. He stiffened. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. One chair shifting, then another, then another. Like a crowd leaning forward in anticipation. He turned. They had all angled slightly toward him, all at once. He felt his knees weaken. He turned back toward the sheriff's chair. Another object now lay on the seat, something that hadn't been there moments earlier. A badge. Real metal this time. His badge. Except this one was tarnished, older by decades, the center star dulled and nearly rubbed smooth. He touched it. The metal was warm. Words carved into the back caught his eye. No way out. His breath stilled in his throat. The whispering started again, this time louder, overlapping voices, creating a low chant. Sit, 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 sit. He stepped back. The chant grew louder. Sit. He stumbled, his back colliding with a chair in the second row. As soon as he touched it, the wood pulsed under his hand warm, like something alive. He shoved away from it, and something grabbed his ankle. He looked down. A hand. Small, child-sized. Pale fingers curling around his boot. Attached to nothing. He kicked instinctively, stumbling backward and nearly falling. The hand dissolved into dust the moment it lost its grip, drifting upward before sinking into the floorboards. He staggered toward the door, and it opened by itself. He didn't hesitate. He bolted out into the main room. Chest heaving, sweat cold on his neck. The chairs behind him screamed as they scraped into new positions. He braced himself against the table, forcing his breath to steady. This wasn't a haunting. It wasn't a place. It was a cycle, a trap, a ritual, and he was not the first sheriff to walk into it. Something caught his attention, then movement in the corner of his eye. He turned back toward the window. His reflection no longer mimicked him. It no longer smiled. It beckoned. A slow crook of the finger. He backed away, but the reflection stepped closer. When the glass fogged for a moment with his breath, the reflection's fog pattern didn't match his. The reflection whispered, lips moving soundlessly. Finish it. He shook his head. No, I'm getting out. I am not part of this. I am not staying here. The reflection only tilted its head, as if in pity, as if he were a child who didn't understand the rules of a game already in motion. The radio crackled again. This time, a different voice emerged. Older, ragged, broken. His voice, Caleb, stop fighting. He staggered backward, nearly tripping over the rug. No, he said. No, no. The radio crackled harder. It'll only make it worse. He ripped the radio from his shoulder and flung it across the room. It hit the wall and shattered into pieces. The cabin groaned, deep, angry. The lights dimmed. The walls seemed to press inward. He dropped to his knees, palms flat on the floor, as his breath wheezed out of him. Not real. Real. Not real. A whisper rose behind him, gentle this time. You already sat down. He turned. The sheriff's chair was in the doorway, waiting, and the older version of himself sat in it, head bowed, face hollow, eyes empty. He lifted one weak hand and pointed at Caleb. You finish what I couldn't. Caleb scrambled back, throat tightening as the older version leaned forward, voice thin as paper. And then someone will finish what you couldn't. He dissolved into dust, falling apart in slow motion, collapsing inward and drifting across the floorboards like gray snow. The sheriff's chair remained, waiting. Caleb stared at it, breath trembling. Real. Not real. Real. He pushed himself up slowly, swaying as the cabin shifted under his feet. The floorboards moved like water. The walls breathed. The ceiling above him shuddered with footsteps. Something massive was circling now. Something ancient. Something patient. He turned in a full circle, searching for any door, any disruption, any seam where the world might let him leave. There was none. Just the cabin. And the chair, and the cycle tightening around him like a noose. He clasped his hands to his head, pressing his palms against his temples as the world trembled. The photographs, the badge, the typewriter, the whispers, the figure in the window, the older version of him turning into dust, all pieces of the same design. He whispered to himself, over and over, not real. Real. Not real. Not real. Real. But the cabin answered, a low whisper rising from the floorboards, from the walls, from the ceiling beams. Real. And then, the front door opened, gently, silently, as if inviting him out, as if he had a choice. Caleb took one breath and stepped forward. Caleb stopped at the threshold. On the other side of the open door lay the forest, silent, unmoving, drenched in a pale light that didn't match any time of day he knew. Not morning, not dusk, something in between. The kind of light one sees in dreams just before waking, when nothing holds quite the right shape. He hesitated, hand hovering inches from the frame. Behind him, the cabin pressed close. Though he wasn't touching it, he could feel it in the air, the pulse of old wood, the slow flex of beams expanding and contracting as though with breath. The presence of something waiting, watching. And beneath that, a deeper awareness, as if the cabin knew that once he stepped outside, something would change. Or begin. He forced himself to look straight ahead. The trees had rearranged themselves again, though not as tightly as before. A narrow path had appeared, one single corridor of bare earth threading deeper into the woods. The trunks leaned just enough to suggest direction rather than menace. The path felt intentional. Caleb did not trust it. He stepped out onto the porch. The boards beneath his boots held firm, but there was no sound. No creaking, no shifting. Even the air seemed reluctant to disturb the silence. He reached the last step and paused. Behind him, the cabin door clicked closed. Softly, too softly. He turned just enough to look back. The door had no knob still, no seam. Just the shape of a door without the function of one. A thought moved through him, quiet, cold. Had it opened for him, or pushed him out? He stepped off the final stair. The ground was unnaturally smooth. No leaves, no twigs, no mud. Only a clean strip of earth, as though something had dragged its palm across the forest floor to clear a way for him. He followed the path. With each step, the silence deepened. Blackwater's woods were never silent. There were always birds, insects, wind, the distant echo of the river. But now, nothing. The trees were motionless. Their branches formed a canopy so dense that the sky disappeared. The air thinned, tasted faintly metallic. The path curved once, gently, like a guiding hand. Caleb kept walking. Not real. Real? Not real. His thoughts looped, circling each other like wolves around a dying fire. The path seemed to go on longer than the woods should allow. But every time he wondered how far he'd come, a new marker would appear. A split trunk, a fallen branch, a crooked stump. Familiar shapes he had seen before along the old county trails, except none of these had been here earlier. He would have sworn on every badge he'd ever worn that this part of the forest hadn't existed before the cabin. Eventually, the path opened into a small clearing. Caleb stopped. He knew this place. He shouldn't, but he did. Years ago, when he was young, too young to be out alone, he had wandered into these woods and found himself in a clearing just like this. No cabin then. Just trees. Just silence. Just a moment he could never fully recall afterward, like a memory missing its middle. His mother had found him hours later, kneeling in the exact center of the clearing, staring at nothing. He had no memory of how he got there. Not real. Real. Not real. He stepped forward. The clearing held no cabin now, but it held something else. A single wooden post rose from the center of the clearing. Old, weathered, cracked. It might once have been part of a fence, or a marker for something long forgotten. Carved into the wood, faint, nearly erased by time, were the words, "Return when called." Caleb reached out and touched the carving. The wood warmed under his fingertips, pulsing once, like a heartbeat rising to meet his palm. He jerked his hand away. A rustle came from behind him. He spun. No one stood there. But the trees had shifted again. The branches now formed a shape he recognized, a doorway. A frame. Tall, arched, unmistakable. An entry. An exit. A beginning. An end. Which one depended entirely on where he stood. He backed away until his boots met the wooden post again. The forest around him seemed to move with his breath, inhaling when he did, exhaling when he let go. The world tightened in subtle ways, barely perceptible, but impossible to ignore. He lifted his eyes to the tree-formed doorway, and saw himself standing in it, older, tired, dirt on his face, uniform torn, eyes hollow and resigned. The same version he had seen in the photograph. The older Caleb raised his hand, not beckoning, not warning, simply lifting it, as though acknowledging an old acquaintance. Then he mouthed a single word, cycle. Caleb staggered back. "No," he whispered. "No. I'm not doing this. I'm not." The trees shifted, the clearing tightened, and from behind him, the cabin's door creaked open again, even though it was nowhere in sight. He felt it in the air. The cabin had let him walk. It had allowed him distance. It had shown him pieces of truth. But now it wanted him back. A faint whisper drifted through the clearing. "You finish what I couldn't." His own voice, from the dust of his older self. Caleb shook his head, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. He ran. The path reformed beneath him, guiding him whether he wanted it to or not. Branches bowed aside. Roots pulled back. The forest rearranged itself like a stage play shifting scenes. He burst through a thicket, branches clawing at his sleeves, and stumbled into open road. He froze. County Road 17. His cruiser sat where he had parked it earlier, lights off, engine cold, a thin layer of dew on the windshield. Fog drifted low across the pavement. The world looked normal. He spun behind him. No cabin, no clearing, just trees. He stumbled toward the cruiser, fumbling for the door handle. He yanked it open, threw himself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. His breath fogged the glass. His hands shook violently on the steering wheel. He jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine started immediately. Relief hit him so hard he nearly sobbed. He grabbed the radio, forgetting for a moment that it was broken, only to see it sitting whole and intact on the dash. He hesitated. The radio crackled. A voice came through, clear, steady, familiar. His own voice. "Dispatch, I've arrived at the structure near mile 9. Appears abandoned. Investigating now." His blood turned to ice. He sat absolutely still, listening as the recording repeated. He checked the timestamp. It read tomorrow's date. His throat tightened as he stared out the windshield, unable to breathe. The fog parted briefly, and in that moment, far down the road, a cabin stood, just barely visible through the haze. Waiting, watching, listening, he whispered to himself, desperate, trembling. Not real, not real. But the fog closed again, and a whisper rose through the static on the radio. Real. The last word stretched thin as paper. The road fell silent. Caleb exhaled shakily and put the cruiser in reverse, backing away from mile 9 with a caution born of terror rather than training. As the car rolled backward, the fog behind him swirled, gathering in slow spirals. A shape formed, a figure, small, child-sized, standing at the forest's edge. Watching him leave, he did not stop. He did not look again. The cruiser reached the turn, and he swung onto the main road, the fog swallowing the woods behind him. The radio crackled one last time. A whisper, a laugh, small, nervous, impossibly close. "You don't believe me, do you?" Static rose. Wind moved faintly. Paper rustled somewhere inside the cabin that no longer existed. Then, a final whisper, soft as breath on the back of a neck. "And if you're hearing this, it already knows you." Static swallowed the world, and everything faded into silence.